Good afternoon, and welcome to this special edition of Phosphorescence, which is the Emily Dickinson Museum's monthly poetry reading series. Other programs in this series, scheduled in 2026, can be found pretty soon on our website, which is emilydickinsonmuseum.org. I'm Jane Wald, Executive Director of the Emily Dickinson Museum, which I should tell you is located just a few blocks north of here on Main Street. We just opened for our 2026 season yesterday, so we hope you'll find a good time to visit today or in the future. I am delighted to welcome poets Paisley Rekdal and Brandon Somm and Ruth Dickey from the National Book Foundation for a conversation about poetry. For Phosphorescence, this is a Dickinson word, and I try to find something slightly different to say about it each year, because Dickinson used it pretty sparingly. And it's a word with a special meaning for her. As a natural scientific phenomenon, we don't, she knew that it was a scientific term, but did she have in mind like the quality of luminosity without heat, a strange concept in itself, or perhaps a process of absorption of facts or experiences or sensitivities, and then subsequent transmission of those facts in some kind of altered state. Well, whatever it was, to Dickinson, phosphorescence meant something extraordinary, something elevated, and something especially vital. And it was on a plane with poetry. So today, in our conversation, our readings about poetry, our conversation about it later, I want to just say that this is the final program in what's been a spectacular 10th anniversary program for LitFest, where we've enjoyed an immersion in some of the most extraordinary literature of our time from some of the most talented writers of our time. LitFest comes about each year from many months of work and teamwork by numerous campus partners, led by LitFest director and editor-in-chief of The Common, Jennifer Acker. The Common also celebrating an anniversary, its 15th this year. And is produced by colleagues in the college's conferences and special events office. We extend a special thanks to President Michael Elliott for his support and that of the Office of the President for this festival. And we're especially grateful for the partnership of the National Book Foundation for all of these programs. So this afternoon, we'll get to spend some time considering this phosphorescence, this luminosity of poetry by Brandon Somm and Paisley Rekdal, followed by their conversation with Ruth Dickey. But before I introduce our speakers, I just want to cover a couple of sort of housekeeping points. First of all, there'll be a time toward the end of the conversation when we'd like to entertain questions from you, the audience, and we'll do this by collecting Q&A cards that will be distributed to you by ushers and then collected a little further along in the program. So please feel free to prepare your questions legibly, and the ushers will collect those cards at the proper time. And then second, our guests will sign books that in the lobby behind you, where you can also purchase their books. So now I'm thrilled to make some introductions. Brandon Somm is a Chicano and Chinese American poet. His most recent poetry collection, Tripas, was awarded the 2024 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry and was a finalist for the National Book Award. He is also the author of The Tribute Horse, which won the 2015 Kate Tufts Discovery Award. He lives in San Diego on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation and teaches literature and creative writing at the University of California in San Diego. Paisley Rekdal is the author of 4 books of nonfiction and 7 books of poetry, including Nightingale, Appropriate, A Provocation, and most recently, West, a translation, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and won the 2024 Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award and the Mountains and Plains Booksellers Reading the West Poetry Award. She is the editor and creator of the Digital Archives projects West, Mapping Literary Utah, and Mapping Salt Lake City. Her work has received the Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an NEA Fellowship, Pushcart Prizes, the Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, among others. Paisley is the former Poet Laureate of Utah, and she teaches at the University of Utah, where she directs the American West Center. Brandon Paisley will be joined by Ruth Dickey for conversation after their readings. Ruth is executive director of the National Book Foundation and has spent over 25 years working at the intersection of community building, writing, and art. A poet herself, Ruth has just published a collection titled Mud Blooms earlier this year. Ruth previously led arts organizations in Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Cincinnati, and now in Seattle as executive director of Seattle Arts and Lectures. She served as a fiction judge for the National Book Awards, and as mentioned, holds an MFA in poetry from UNC Greensboro, a BS in Foreign Service, and an MA in Latin American Studies from Georgetown University. So please now join me in welcoming all of our guests, and especially Ruth Dickey, who will start us with our program today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. Hello, all. I'm Ruth Dickey. It's my tremendous pleasure to serve as Executive Director of the National Book Foundation. Can you hear me, or do I need to move this up? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jane, for that very warm welcome and for your partnership on this afternoon's event. I'm so happy to join all of you in celebrating 10 years of Amherst College's LitFest and 10 years of partnership with the National Book Foundation. I'd love to extend my heartfelt thanks to all the people who make LitFest possible, especially the President's Office, Jen Acker and the team at the Common, Amherst College's Conference and Special Events team, and Amherst Books. This past fall, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the National Book Awards, along with a key milestone for our year-round efforts at the Foundation to reach readers in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico through our education and public programs. Our annual partnership to connect with readers in Amherst as part of LitFest has meant so much to us, and I hope you'll all subscribe to our e-newsletter, which is out on the table in the front lobby, to stay in touch and join us for other online offerings, including event live streams, Read with NBF, which features monthly exclusives on our most recent National Book Award winners, and the return of our summer reading adventure for adults in May. For today's program, it's such a privilege to get to be in conversation with two honorees from our 2023 National Book Award for Poetry, Paisley Rekdal and Brandon Son. As Jane mentioned, Paisley and Brandon will give us a taste of their work, and then we'll chat about all things poetry, language, and process. We promise to save time at the end for your questions, as Jane mentioned, so please do take advantage of the question cards and send your questions up, which will be collected and make their way to me. Following the event, the authors will sign books in the lobby, so I hope you each buy copies of these two beautiful books. With many thanks to Amherst Books for being our bookseller. And now I'm delighted to turn the program over to our authors, who will start with a reading. And Brandon, we'll start with you.
Hi, y'all. It's great to be here. Thanks so much. Thanks for making it out. I want to thank Ruth. I want to thank Jane for the introductions today. I want to thank everyone here at LitFest. It's been an amazing weekend of literature and conversation. And I really want to especially thank the students I got to meet and be in dialogue with yesterday, and who showed me around the campus, Aiden and Mel and Kai and Sam as well. I really appreciate your work, so thank you. It's so great to be here. I'm thrilled. if you were like me, you were at the Teju Cole event yesterday, which was just phenomenal. I'm a huge fan of Teju, and you saw him when called upon to do so, actually recite from memory a Emily Dickinson poem, and not a popular, not like a greatest hits either. It was kind of like a deep cut, like a rare B-side Emily Dickinson, and it was so impressive, and I was in awe, as so many of us were. And I just wanted to, at the very start, say that I will not be reciting anything from memory. Please don't ask me to do so. But I do want to start out with a poem by another poet. I want to read a poem by Lucha Corpi. Lucha Corpi identifies as a Chicana poet, and Lucha Corpi originally was born in Veracruz, in the southern part of Veracruz, and there on the eastern coast of Mexico and on the Gulf of Mexico, right? And yeah, woo! Yeah, I mean, the fact that just saying that out loud is an act of resistance now is really so crazy and so absurd, but so necessary to say. And of course, in the Gulf of Mexico and the word Mexico, it is derived from the indigenous Mexica. And the Mexica people, the indigenous people, are there today and were there before the Spanish came, and before the Spanish obviously conquered and colonized and brought with them their own list of name changes. And so I think teaching poets like Lucha Corpi, Chicano poets like Lucha Corpi are really important to standing up to US imperialism, US empire. So the poem is called Emily Dickinson. And Lucha Corpi writes both in Spanish and English. She wrote this in Spanish, and I'll read the English translation also. It's by Catherine Rodriguez Nieto. And for the Spanish speakers in the audience, please forgive my pocho Spanish. Emily Dickinson. Como tú, soy de ayer, de las bahías en donde se ancla el día a esperar su propia hora. Como yo, eres de hoy, del andar de esa hora en la que apenas palpita lo que aún no ha nacido. Somos cultivadoras de indecibles, dejadoras de singulares, campesinas, migratorias en busca de chinampas, aún sin siembra y sin cosecha. Emily Dickinson, like you, I belong to yesterday, to the bays where day is anchored to wait for its hour. Like me, you belong to today, the progression of that hour when what is unborn begins to throb. We are cultivators of the unsayable, weavers of singulars, migrant workers in search of floating gardens as yet unsown, as yet unharvested. Like you, I belong to yesterday. Like me, you belong to today. If we draw a line between the you and the I and the me in those two sentences, they make an X. And in literature classes, we talk about that rhetorical device as a chiasmus. It's a crossing, an intersection, a dialogue and exchange that very much my work comes out of. My work from the perspective of a Chicano and the perspective of someone from the southern Chinese diaspora, a diaspora out of a province called Guangzhou, an ancestry that I share with Paisley, which makes this reading so special to me. I'm a huge fan of Paisley Rekdal's work, and it's an honor to be here. This poem's called Telefono Roto. They say her cry is heard near water. My nana says she heard the story first as a child and then years later on the line at Motorola from a woman raised near Bisbee. Chisme y dichos, hearsay as they inspected the endless circuitry through microscopes. Fordism's orders, overseers and foremen told her they would make phones that fit inside a pocket. Yo no lo creía, she said. If we remove their cases, the verbs creer and to create share similar wiring. Some of those components were washed, degreased with toxic solvents, trichloroethylene, that Motorola for years spilled and flushed carelessly. A plume of poisoned groundwater stretches beneath Phoenix from the East Valley to the west, past downtown where my father ran his store, a tiendita called Faye's, but that many knew as Los Chinos. After a 9-year fight with cancer, my father passed away in 2018. In 1989, Motorola moved the production line my nana worked on to Mexico, once the company was served with fines for what's now a Superfund site. We might trace this production line from Phoenix to Guadalajara to subsidiaries in Guangzhou, where my father's family emigrated from, first my yeye in the 20s and later my yenyeng and aigu in 1948, the year the first transistor was invented. I might hear in that technology my family's song in broken pieces, bits of gossip like a game of telephone or Chinese whispers. Your own, cries Llorona from those little phones inside our pockets. This title and this poem starts off with a photo montage from the Mexican photographer and artist Lola Alvarez Bravo. Sirenas del Aire, 1958. I am sitting with mermaids of the air, their fishtails from a monger's stall, where they were lifted from ice bed to butcher's block and wrapped in newsprint. Now they type over carriage and keys, these two sirens and their Olivetti. I imagine the photographer reading Homer and considering how in both inspiration and temptation we encounter a beseeching, or thinking that the mermaids with their knowledge of tides and the late summer's phosphorescence might say something about the startling beauty of betweenness. My father, born in 51 in Phoenix, once found with me on the dim sum's placemat his rabbit sign. Jackrabbit, I think now, so called for its long ears, similar to a pack donkey. Scrubland critter beneath prickly pear, a sage eater preyed upon by hawk and harvester in the sod and cotton fields outside Avondale, where my father kept his shop. Then the char siu came, sliced with its red edges like a kiss on a napkin. I knew, of course, La Sirena. On the loteria, my nana called from the deck. With dried beans for markers, we listened on the edge of bingo. Afterward, we gathered each bean to cook with garlic and salt, maybe a piece of saved fat that simmered as we slept until morning when Nana would be returning from third shift. Homer never describes the sirens as sexy. At other times in history, they are part bird and not fish at all. Euripides lists them as servants of Persephone crossing between this world and the next. The montage leaps with modernism's mixing of perspectives, empire's far-flung violence, and fragmentation. Some say bingo echoes a Cantonese word that asks who, asks which person. If Googled, Sirenas de Aire shows us ads for air raid sirens. Can you see my string of beans, its rosary of call and response over images, so suddenly, so briefly, all in a row? The indigenous activists Amber Ortega and Nellie Jo David peacefully obstructed the building of the border wall along the Arizona and Sonora desert. They peacefully obstructed the wall building by sitting in the front end loader of a digger. And this next poem talks about this act of resistance, and it starts with a epigraph from one of those activists, Nellie Jo David. I just felt like he was fighting us with his machine. Resistors. In Guadalajara, to see where Motorola took the line my grandmother worked on, I can't find the site, but spend the days in naves of a deconsecrated church, looking up at frescoes by Orozco. Here is a horse, a toe chain for tail, train piston for hawk and hoof. Over murdered Mexica, Cortez stands, lug nut hips and kneecaps, gauntleted hand at the sword hilt, silver as a knot of solder. Opposite him, the Franciscan and his Latin cross, miter-sawed angles hewn down to dagger point, and an angel in assembly line armor, lifting a bloodied banner with the stenciled letters of an alphabet, the one I must have started learning, sing-song in the pitch and timbre of Milk Teeth at 48th and Willetta, a one-bedroom duplex west of Papago's greasewood and buttes of sandstone, and a block down from the Motorola, where my grandmother punched in nights to look after a conveyor of semiconductors, those nascent, ancient rotaries strung up to starlight and empire, gaslighting like the gassed painting of progress and whiteness, wrapped in telegraph wire, lithe and looping as cake shop box string. No wall on autumn land, I hear the woman today protests from the bucket of a front-end loader. a caterpillar, by her presence dumbstruck on treadwheels tall as vault doors, its maw metal hollow, a confessional or old Mountain Bell phone booth she stepped into amid the felled saguaro and ribs of organ pipe. Her body, where dirt goes, says her body is the land the wall wants to eat. I stream this, download by data plan, by bandwidth, from the cloud servers deep in their grid deserts to the crystalline and rare earth minerals, making my cell phone black box theater, making her code, making her algorithm, both soprano and Mario Savio, the solder seemingly quantum leap from soldada and solidarity. Still, I remember the ram's horn baritone in my nana's King James. Imagine her driving those years with riders to shepherd the sound through solid state. And know the harder truth, the defiant mic this woman makes resonates with her body within the digger's teeth. And I'll close with this poem. Thanks again for listening. Thanks for being here. Transmitter. In Judy Vaca's mural, The Great Wall, a Chichimeca woman on comet tail of field corn hovers and whispers in the ear of Edison, the Zacatecan, the secrets of the light bulb. Orale, my mom texts, but autocorrect sends oracle instead. I remember as a kid looking up from the passenger seat at the work badge my grandmother, after each shift, clipped to the rearview mirror's wood bead rosary. A dashboard milagro in the dial light of her Chevy, its tooth glass bit into the Hail Marys as if to test the solder of that circuitry. She often tells me of Mexican movie stars, Maria Felix, Jorge Negrete, Pedro Infante, how they toured the US movie houses and signed the ticket stubs she sold from a box office, skinny as a phone booth. A transmitter made from gold beater skin, stretched across a hoop drum. Bell's phonautograph used pig bristle for a stylus to sign his speech waves on a plate of smoked glass. I watched on YouTube Infante stand with 11 mariachis, gallant in silk ties and epaulets, to serenade Paloma, his tenor crooning about the unrequited man turned dove with grief, to the actress in bedclothes, and bewitched, as I imagine, Helmholtz, the pianist, holding a tuning fork to an electromagnet. Trying to picture that man wasting away in heartache and so hollowed to bird bones, I reread this morning Socrates telling Phaedrus outside the city walls of cicadas how they were men before muses brought them song. Unaware the cost, I climbed mesquite limbs for the discarded skins, brittle as chicharrones, and cupped their matchlight in my boy hands. Hearing, it is said, is touch at a distance. Ola is amp and trough. Frequency equals waves passing a given point. My nana's voice is creosote and parliaments. Tenor and rasp that sidewind cell towers over chevrons of Ocotillo through Ironwood and Arroyo. Moving in the megahertz her hands made. Thank you.
That was really beautiful. I want to say a quick thank you to everyone at Amherst for having us out. This has been a really extraordinary weekend, and thank you all for coming out. It's a pleasure to spend time with all of you and certainly to hear Brandon's lovely work. I've been aware of Brandon's work for a while, so I've been excited about this conversation because there's a fair amount of crossover. Before I read some of the poems from West, some of you most of you probably don't know anything about this book, which is fine. I was commissioned as Utah's Poet Laureate to write a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad for its 150th anniversary of its completion, which, as many of you know, completed in Utah. I'm half Chinese, so I said, I'll happily write you a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad. What I wanted to do was link another historical event to the Transcontinental Railroad's completion, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act. 13 years after the Transcontinental was completed, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed into law, and it stayed in effect until, I believe, 1943. As somebody who comes from a West Coast Chinese-American family, that is an act that affected my family's history and many of the histories of people on the West Coast. So I took a poem that had been carved into the walls of Angel Island Immigration Station in Chinese that elegized a fellow Chinese detainee who had committed suicide while in detention sometime during the Chinese Exclusion Act. I take this poem and I translate it character by character into the stories of the different railroad workers and the cultural impact of the railroad in general on American life. I will be reading some poems that are based on documents. A lot of these poems are not actually in my voice as a poet at all, which is kind of funny because I wrote a book about cultural appropriation in literature, and this entire book is an appropriation. Some of these voices you're going to like, some of these voices you will not. I'll start with one that you might not. While I was doing the research for this book in 2018, 2019, I was interested in who was president during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and it was Andrew Johnson, who was impeached. And I was very interested in that because, of course, at the time I was writing this, President Donald Trump was president for his first go-around. And I came across this quote about Andrew Johnson's Swing Around the Circle train tour in 1866. He had taken this train tour to stump for Democrats at the time, and Andrew Johnson was later blamed for basically having a very lax policy around Reconstruction, which allowed Jim Crow laws to proliferate in the South. And this is the quote. If he would stay in the White House, keep his mouth shut, and not make a fool of himself, disgusting friend and foe alike, the President of the United States might command some respect. I take this epigraph and it starts a poem. It's a contrapuntal poem. Some of you might know a contrapuntal poem is basically 3 poems. On one side of the page, you can read all of the lines down to create one poem. On the other side of the page, you can read all the lines down to read a different poem, and then you read them across. So this is a poem that has the speeches of Andrew Johnson on the left-hand side, the speeches of Donald J. Trump on the right-hand side. I'll read each one individually, and then I'll read the poem as it is meant to be read together. The poem's title is Sad. This is Johnson. At this particular crisis of the American people, I cling to the Constitution. Notwithstanding a mendacious press, that common gang of cormorants and bloodsuckers, the pains Congress has taken to malign what all patriotic men should rally round, there is no power that can control me. Before I would see this government destroyed, I would send every Negro back to Africa. I will indeed be your Moses. There are a good many people, but this is a country for white men, hence you can see why I've been assaulted. I hand over to you this flag, though imprisoned. I feel confident you agree to the same great doctrine, if these are your tender mercies, God. We have shattered the mentality, the broken promises, jobless recoveries, tired platitudes. Nobody has done anything like I've been able to do. I alone can fix that strong border. They want a wall, that Chinese virus, I call it, because when somebody is president of the United States, that authority is total to silence your voices on social media. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crimes, sad. And then you get into legal semantics on both sides. So we had a campaign. Sorry, women. Thank you for that big victory. It's called total acquittal, and now I am your voice. I view everybody as a threat except for possibly Abe Lincoln. Trust me, there will be no lies. At this particular crisis, we have shattered the mentality of the American people. I cling to the Constitution, the broken promises, jobless recoveries, tired platitudes. Notwithstanding a mendacious press, nobody has done anything like I've been able to do. That common gang of cormorants and bloodsuckers I alone can fix the pains Congress has taken to malign that strong border. They want a wall, what all patriotic men should rally round. That Chinese virus, I call it, because there is no power that can control me. When somebody is president of the United States, that authority is total. Before I would see this government destroyed to silence your voices on social media, I would send every Negro back to Africa. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crimes. Sad. I will indeed be your Moses. And then you get into legal semantics. There are a good many people on both sides. So we had a campaign. But this is a country for white men. Sorry, women. Thank you for that big victory. Hence, you can see why I've been assaulted. It's called total acquittal, and now I hand over to you this flag. Though imprisoned, I am your voice. I view everybody as a threat. I feel confident you agree to the same great doctrine, except for possibly Abe Lincoln. If these are your tender mercies, God, trust me, there will be no lies. I know that people are like, do I applaud or start weeping? Hard to say, hard to say. This poem is an imaginative, what we would consider a sort of subject appropriation, but I was really interested in the histories of people that might not have been told and maybe not be able to be told because there are no archival documents that we found yet. So this is an imagination of two male workers on the railroad, and the translation is, "What day?" On the 7th day of the 7th month, magpies bridge in a cluster of black and white. The Sky King crosses to meet his queen, time tracked by the close-knit wheeling of stars. I watch. You come to me tonight, drunk on wine and cards, nails ridged black with opium to ease the pain of work. We are all men here. Any body can be a bridge, little raven. Your eyes squeeze shut, but not from pain. We are a trestle, a grade we build together. What matter if you say you'd never choose me, were there women willing in this desert? I chose. I choose the memory we share of rivers, your hair of smoke and raw, wet leather. A man in another man's hand makes himself tool or weapon, says the overseer, as if a man's use to another is only one of work. Pleasure is our only chosen future. You are the home I briefly make, the country I can return to. Here, where the moon wheels its white shoulder in the dark, as you push me to the earth, slip my whiskered tip of hair into your mouth. This one is a little tough to read, as you'll hear. So I'll start drinking now. I wanted to know about hobos on the train, and I did some research, but then I started wondering whether people still ride the train illegally, and they do. So I took some interviews with some people who they call themselves riders, who are jumping trains, and instead of looking for work, they're looking for escape. They're looking to get away from things. They're not traveling out into the West to find new lives so much as to erase old ones in some cases. One guy from Afghanistan said it was the closest thing to being back in war, to be in the train, because the train is this very all-consuming very physical experience when you're riding it illegally, like on the tops of these trains. And I wanted to capture some level of that physicality of their experience, as you're going to hear in the rhythm of this. This translates to dead. Dead is what they call a torn-up track whose living rails I jumped to bed down in the wells and feel the thud hit every trestle steam at dawn like horses at the track. I trained before the fillies foundered sick. They fired the agents' vets. They ride the riders me. I love how in a well you thrum with sound until your bare lips start to bleed. Like canisters of oil I stole inside the train. You'll find a nation what it wants to eat and wear and what it likes to buy, a ring, a phone, some jeans, a Porsche. There is no reason why to jump a train except to lose the edges of yourself. That time like pacing Moxie at the track, that speed that almost tears her hands up at the wrist. She was the last to go, her tendon bowed and worthless than insurance. No one rides a racehorse just for pleasure. No one hops a train if they can take a plane, a car whose engine speed is gauged by horses kept alive in memory. For sentiment, I guess there's ghosts of what we were and are we cannot bear to leave out in the desert where I'm going home, just not right now, I said of Moxie. Not right now before the race. She hasn't many left in her. You know she trusts you, right? The owner said, then slip me $2,000 and the shots. Yeah. And I did that with cough syrup in me, so it's a real triumph of the will. This is my last poem, and this is one where I feel like I'm very much in conversation with Brandon's work. I was very interested in, obviously, leaving myself out, actually, of this book, but there were times when I felt myself pulled into writing this book, and via some of the documents that I was reading. One of the people I ended up studying was a biracial 19th, early 20th century journalist named Suisun Farr, who rode the train, wrote about the Chinese communities that she was encountering. But on the way, she also wrote about her own experience growing up biracial, living in Seattle, where I was born and raised, and what that meant to her. This poem is called Not Ash, and the lines, many of them come from her essay, Leaves from the Mental Portfolio of a Eurasian. I remember the boy who called me dirty, and the French women who hissed pauvre petite as I passed on the street. And I remember the girl like me at school, who pasted her face with white paint and blacked her brows to pass, she said, as Mexican. I remember everything for which I was made to feel ashamed. Even the fact my father said I would never make half the woman my mother was because of my heart, which the doctor now calls unusually large. Memory is the weakness I bear on my own. I come from a race on my mother's side said to be the most stolid and insensible, yet feel so keenly alive to suffering, it hurts to hear the words strangers use for Chinese shopkeepers, or watch the Chinamen here laugh when I say I am of their race. I, who but for a few phrases remain unacquainted with my mother tongue. I have the name my English father gave me, and I look like my father. I could be loved if I lived as if I were like him, too. But I prefer the name I have invented for myself. I want the world to see my mother in me, regardless if the Chinese have no souls. I do not need a soul. It is not my soul in question here, in these hot glances, these furious whispers. Why care for love when I do not know if I should love others in return? Love is a white loneliness that swells the heart and shuts me out from pleasure. What is there for one like me to do but wander, a pioneer traveling between west and east, myself the link they threaten to destroy between them? I do not need a name on legal papers. Here is a match. Here is the mirror in which my pale face burns its flickering allegiances. My soul is everywhere on my person. I lose nothing of myself that has not already disappeared. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you both so much for those beautiful readings. And you each read poems that were favorites of mine, so that was a special treat. So please, everyone, start writing down your questions, and kick us off. I'd love to start with talking a little bit about translation. And Brandon, thinking about translation, I love the many ways that you interrogate and play with Spanish and English and Chinese. I'm thinking of the link that you draw in a poem that you read between creer and to create, finding echo and hecho, and from close reading, your grandmother saying, hope and wanting are one word. Can you please talk about how working cross language and translation informs your poems and your process?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that question. Paisley, that was amazing. Thank you for that reading. It was so good. Yeah. I think this is such a great question for both of us. And yeah, and also it gives me an opportunity to talk about my relationship to my heritage languages. I grew up primarily speaking English in a monolingual home. Grew up with my mother. My parents were divorced when I was 2. I was hearing Spanish because my nana, my mom's mom, was taking care of me. I have a 4-year-old now, so I think a lot about, and I'm writing about caregiving and the labor of caregiving. And one of the main reasons my nana was working nights was so that she could raise her own kids and also raise her grandkids, me. And so my mom was dropping me off at my nana's house, and I was hearing Spanish. Primarily, my nana would talk to my tata, my grandparents, would talk in Spanish, and I was hearing Spanish. I would later then study Spanish in school, and I still take Spanish classes. I'm going to be taking Spanish classes for all of my life, and gladly so. I also was hearing Chinese, specifically a dialect from the area of China that my parents immigrated from in South China. We speak a dialect that's known as Taishanese. We're from Huiping, or now it's known as Kaiping. So it's kind of like Taishanhua dialect, and it's not Mandarin and it's not Cantonese. So it's a little harder for me to learn that language, and I'm often going online to different forums and communities that are writing about it and continue to teach from it. And that process of learning and being connected to my languages is transcribed or written into the book. One of the translation practices that so many of us in immigrant families or in immigrant lives is in Spanish is what I'm calling a kind of como se dice poetics. So I'm constantly calling my nana up and saying, como se dice plums, or como se dice, eyelashes, And sometimes, she can answer. Sometimes I stump her and she'll say, that's a good one, and we'll look it up together, But invariably that act of asking my elders, how to say things, invariably it leads to storytelling, right? Which is so important and so vital. And then on my Chinese side, like I said, I grew up hearing Chinese spoken between my father and between my grandparents, my Ying Ying and Yaya. Paisley has a gong gong and
Yeah,
po
po
po,
po,
which
yeah.
is the mother's side. I'm on my father's side, so I have a Ying Ying and Yaya. They passed away, but I did have, and so they were speaking this dialect in the family store, and so I grew up on the weekends going to the store and working in the store, and that's where I heard Chinese. And now I'm primarily speaking to my Aigu, which is my oldest aunt, and she came over with my grandmother, as I say in that poem, in 1948. So she was already 13. So she's kind of the translator for me, and she's in the book as well. And she's teaching me in one poem my grandmother's maiden name. And we actually were able to take a photocopy because she was writing the characters out. And when it came time to publish the book, I said, can we just take a picture of her handwriting? So her handwriting is literally in the book too, which I think is very special. So yeah, I'm not fluent in my languages. I'm always engaging with those languages. I think it's important to do so, and I think again, it's not. I mean, languages is how we understand and see the world, and so I'm always trying to understand and see the world through my multiple communities, my multiple languages. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Paisley, I love how West contains, and for those of y'all who haven't read the book, there are beautiful essays in the back that correspond to the poems in the front. And in one of them, you have a line about translation. You write, "And yet, what is translation except a carefully cultivated loss?" And I'd love to hear more about how you think about translation and this project in general.
Yeah, I'm not fluent in Chinese at all. I grew up in a monolingual household as well, and also, but with Chinese filtering through. But I've done a lot of different kinds of translation work over my life, in different classes and for different projects. And, one of the things that really does strike me about that kind of absence, which radiates not only just in my life, but in the collection as a whole, is that some absences are intentional. Like my grandparents didn't want their kids to speak Chinese. They wanted perfectly assimilated, children. And, you go to the archive and you're looking, I mean, I wanted to find documents written by Chinese workers, and we haven't found any. They haven't been preserved for whatever reason. And so, but, the act of writing history and the act of writing in general is a kind of translation of fact, emotion, sentiment, the past into language that even as we're using it, we know is insufficient. So we recognize almost instantly we're losing as much as we're putting down at the same time. And that's something that's always haunted me. And I think that's sort of the spirit of the project, which is like, for every voice that I managed to get in here, I think of everything from adoption to African American laborers to Irish Americans to Mormons to the Plains Indian War. I mean, we could go on forever. Polygamy, prostitution, Hollywood, but every single thing is an absence as well because something else couldn't make it into the book. And so, yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm translating some aspect of history even as I'm like, but it's not the original. It's not the real thing, right? But that's going to be the case for all of us.
To stay for one beat longer on that, I know that this book also has a digital life to it. So you were translating between mediums, and how did
Yeah.
that play into the project?
Well, yeah, so the back of the book has a QR code that takes you to a website. And so you can play the Chinese poem in the sense that you click on the characters and they open up into video poems too. And you can hear sounds, you can see images and things like that, and music and stuff like that. As soon as I got this commission and as soon as I started doing the research, I knew I wanted something multimedia. So my very first iteration of this project was me reading while a video was streaming behind me that I had created, which was really stress-inducing because I had to like hit every, I had a mirror so I could see where I was to make sure I wasn't getting behind. But that I also immediately knew that no one else could experience what those archival documents and images unless they were, I was reading physically to them. So then I thought a website makes a lot of sense. And increasingly, I've had this conversation with other people. I live in a state where they're banning books, and books are political objects. And whether you want them to be or not, they have that. And one of the things that really struck me as I was doing this project was, I didn't get taught this history when I was in school. And I thought if I could have a free website that anyone could access, any, high school kids could play with and look at, that would be really important. So I see it as its own book that will always kind of live. At the same time, websites degrade in ways that I find really fascinating. And I also chose a website because when we think about the internet as maybe an analogous kind of technology to the transcontinental, it changed everything, just every aspect of American culture. There's something about a website where rather like the railroad, as soon as you built it, you have to rebuild it. It's constantly degrading. So my joke to myself is the website will eventually degrade and be unplayable, but the book will continue on, and I'm just going to let it degrade. So yeah, it's my own private art project.
I love it. And I know our time is getting short. I want to make sure we have time for questions from y'all, so please do send them up. Brandon, thinking about history and history that's not visible, I love the ways that you capture your family's history and also Motorola and their history, which was a history that I didn't know. And I'm curious if there were ways as you collected these poems or post-publication that you realized there was unconscious history you didn't expect to be documenting that's there, or kind of how the broader history and your family's history interplayed as you were writing.
Yeah, yeah, history is a really big part of the book, and I really like Paisley's work. I'm such a fan of poems that engage with history, and I think that poetry is a really interesting genre and medium for history. I mean, I think just in thinking about the poem as a technology, you know, for the tradition of poetry, the technology of meter and rhyme has always been about being able to memorize something and remember something, and so that sense of memory and history are really tied with poetics and poetry as form. Um, yeah, I think one of the poems I like to read that I didn't get to read today was that my, in addition to my dad and grandparents' store, my Nana's mom, my grandmother's mom, my bisabuela, we knew her name is Rosario, and we knew her as Nana Chayo. That's the shortened aspect of name for Rosario. My Nana Chayo also had a store, tiendita that was the kind of front room of her home, and she sold chicle, gum, cigarettes, menudo on Fridays, so yeah, there was that store, and then she sold also their raspadas, which is shaved ice, and so there's a poem in the book called Raspadas, and in 72 or 74, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez came. The conservative government in Arizona passed laws prohibiting collective organizing, prohibiting striking during the lettuce harvest. And so Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez came to Arizona, and Chavez actually went on hunger strike. And he did it in this community center called Santa Rita Hall. And it just so happens that that hall is right across the street from my Nana Chayo's, was right across the street from my Nana Chayo's house in Tiendita. So there's an intersection of history that I was able to write about and put into the book. And yeah, so history is a really big part of my work. Yeah.
I'd love, building on that, to hear from each of you. How did you handle research in these projects? And connected, how did you know when you had enough and you had to shift from research to writing? A delicate balance for all of us.
So for me, I started life as a medievalist. Research is the thing I love doing. I love that more than almost anything else. And so I just kept reading and reading and reading, but I kept running up against a lot of absences. I felt myself asking lots of questions and would have a whole list of questions and try to find answers to them. And it was always the question like, who do we not have an historical, record of on the railroad? So I read one obviously about a queer relationship on the railroad. Probably there is a very deep LGBTQ history that could be written about the railroad. It's not being written, I think, because for good reasons that historians are loath to, jump in and produce something that they can't actually prove. But I found myself also looking in footnotes in the archive. So one of the things, if there were no stories necessarily about Chinese workers, Paiute and Ute tribes people would actually have stories of them because there was a lot of intermarriage, there was adoption, things like that. So actually, like, oral histories became really important. But that question of like when to stop researching and start writing was really about time, because I know I had to do it. But this is, I found myself also going back to that Chinese poem and, hovering over those, the translations of those words. And if like anything sparked, then I would knew I had to write, as it attached itself to a particular history. I threw away so many poems. So like this book is like 5 times actually longer than it is. Like I threw out more than I kept. And it just, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for this now as I'm like answering this. Like, how do you do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like for me, it's a process of chaos and intuition and trying to figure things out and piece things together. I don't think that I do have a process where I finish the research and then start writing. I think I'm always writing, and I'm always revising based upon the research. I'm always getting things wrong and have to correct things. I think that there's this really interesting, there's a Latinx scholar and poet, Roberto Tejada, who talks about a researched imagination. And I love that term to connect those processes. And again, I don't think one begins before the other. I think they're always in this dialogue and dialectic. And I think I'm often starting poems on just based on sound and image and just curious things that I'm observing, and at the same time I'm doing research and I'm getting ideas for poems and thinking, oh, that would be really great, but I don't know how to do it. And so at some point my journaling and some point my researching just kind of accidentally comes together, and I'm like, oh, that belongs in that poem. And I feel like it's largely more accident. Which
more intuitive than it is.
which makes it hard to teach. I feel like,
you're like, go do this.
I feel like as a teacher, I'm always like, don't do how I do. Do how I say or something. Because I don't think it is by accident a lot of times.
Go to the
by
archive
time.
and find out what happens in the archive.
Right.
And what's not happening in the archive.
It's something I so love in both of your work. I have a question for you from Liv in the audience, who asks, how do you think that someone might approach translation and learning about other languages as a path into writing or as a path in and of itself? And I'm curious how each of you came to that.
Well, when I said before in the book, it's a translation is a carefully curated loss. I love giving translation little exercises to my students because they have to make these decisions. Like, what do you care about most? Do you care about sound, or do you care about this particular image? Rhyme does not always translate very well into English, depending on what language you're coming into. Certain metrical effects can't cross over. So how do you, what's the closest equivalent? And then you have to really think very closely about audience. Like who are you speaking to? Like, why do you think this piece would translate to the culture that you're writing towards? I think like that's one of those questions that we don't, consider as much. One of the reasons why I think Emily Wilson's translations have done so well is, we're a culture that has come out of a 20-year war ourselves. Whether we're conscious of that or not, we're primed to have that conversation about violence and power and masculinity in surprising ways. You have to make these very conscious kinds of decisions as a translator, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And there's a way in which I've come to understand that, translation is at the heart of poetic practice. It's not separate from it in any ways. And I think there's a lot of great translators and poets like Don Choi and others who are pointing to that and are really helpful in reading. And I think too, I do assign translation projects and assignments as well, just to get, again, this sense of choices. Even the small, one of the things that I've done is there's this great curation of all, it's by the Japanese translator, His last name's Sato. I think it's Hirosat.
Yeah, I know who you're talking
Yeah,
about. Yeah.
Sato. He has a book called Haiku, which is great, and then he has a book where he's collected all of the translations of this famous haiku by Basho, the one where the frog jumps in and plop, you know. Um, um, and that's my translation there on the spot. Very experimental. But anyway, he collects all of them, and there's like some 100 or so of these, you know, 3-line and more. I mean, people get really experimental and fun, and so I usually read those with my students and then assign them to go home and do their own, you know.
Do you know the book 13 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei by Elliot Weinberger? That's a great book as well, where he takes the same poem by Wang Wei and he looks at 13 different translations. And the things that are really eye-opening for me and for anyone who reads it, I think, is like the ones who are actually fluent in Chinese tend to be the worst.
Yeah,
You know, like, you know,
exactly.
you know, he was talking about Gary Snyder's translation turned out to be really quite good. And he said, well, he thought it was probably because Snyder had worked in a forest for a really long time and knew the quality of light that Wang Wei was really trying to get at and really understood like that particular gaze. And that, so linguistic accuracy is the thing that will kill a translation faster than anything else in a weird way. So anyway.
Yeah, and I think in this age of like AI and Googling, I think many of us kind of assume that it's kind of, you know, yeah, that there aren't these really important choices being made, and that artists making those choices is really vital. So yeah.
I think that's so powerful and true. We have time for just 2 more questions, and the first one comes from Rena. And Paisley, she's asking you, but I actually would like to hear both of you talk about this. She writes that in some of the essays in West, you go a historical direction or giving context. In others, they're very personal. And how did you decide in each of the essays which direction to go? And Brendan, a similar question for you. I'd love to hear that as well in your work.
Sadly, it's intuitive. Like I said before, I think on stage, I didn't want myself in this book at all. But as I was putting these things together, I kept sort of asking myself, like, what? I didn't even have to ask myself. After a while, I was like, what are the personal stakes for me here? And they were many. And so I did end up going in a more personal direction. I found myself, I mean, all of the essays, each poem has a lyric historic essay that accompanies it. All the poems create one translation. All the essays create one massive essay. And so at one point, writing a long essay isn't different than writing a really long lyric poem, that you've got a sense of there's got to be some sort of hook or some sort of crisis or something that to keep this narrative actually momentum going. And to a certain extent, I could sense that I needed to bring more of myself in at some of these moments. Sometimes it was just obvious from doing the research, like this speaks directly to my family. My grandfather was adopted into a family, and adoption was one of the themes that comes through the book too. So that was a natural touch point. But other things like my relationship with my mother, which was somewhat fraught, that would come through at different touch points as well. And it had very much to do with race and identity and Americanness. And so this is what this book is about, is race, identity, and American, is who gets to be American, who does not get to be American. And what is American history? Is it progressive? Is it regressive? And that was something that haunted me while I was writing this book, because I think that was a question that the nation was asking at that time. And I think it's a question that the nation is asking again. Are we moving forward? Or are we moving backwards? Or where are we going? And so that dragged me into those essays too.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just celebrate the West for a second, because I just think we were just talking about the website, but I feel like there's a technology and an arrangement in the book that is just so masterful. And one of the things that I find really extraordinary about the book is that there's a kind of genre expectation that you disrupt. I feel like when we've kind of come to expect a lineated poem, a verse poem, to be confessional or to be kind of in a first person perspective, and that's not what we get here. We actually get the first person and the more personal in the prose work that you do at the end of the book, and that's really extraordinary. And I love the way that your table of contents I mean, it's not just notes, right? And I think your table of contents gestures to kind of interwovenness, where you can look at the contents and see the verse and see the prose together. So that's almost like we were speaking about Japanese tradition. It's almost kind of like haibun. You could read the book.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but
that
yeah,
way.
I did that in part to create that question. Like, progressive time moves forward, and that's like the whole railroad idea. Is like you start from one point, you go the other place, and there's something about the book that I designed to be recursive and regressive, so that you can go forward, but you almost always go back because you're like, oh wait, but that goes and refers to this and this and this and this. Thank you.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, I feel like I think I kind of take my note from feminism and Black feminism, and thinking about the relationship between the personal and the political, and that the personal is political, right? And so, yeah, I think that writing about my family's history, and family stories, I do see it as a political act. And the book's title is Tripas, and I was thinking about tripas in relationship to lines, so factory lines, telephone lines, right? Lines of ancestry and heritage. I was thinking about the guts, right? Tripas means guts, right? So thinking about the guts of our technology, the insides of our telephones, but also to have the guts, do I have the guts to write this book, and do I have the guts to, stand up, and speak back to power, right? So having the guts.
I love that. I have so many questions, but we're almost out of time. The last question I wanted to ask, we're in a room of incredible readers and incredible writers, and I wanted to give you each a chance to shout out books that you love that you think everyone in the audience should pick up, in addition to your two beautiful books.
I almost wish you'd ask for a poem by Emily Dickinson now. There's something about when people ask that question, like, I have never read anything before in my life. It just all goes away. Brandon, what are you reading?
I have my notebook here, and I was like, I usually keep a list, and I was like, can I cheat?
Yes.
Yeah. I know. I'm next. Well, I'm what we're teaching. My graduate students and I are reading Fadi Judah, Palestinian American poet, really important poet. We're reading his most recent book. It's the title is ellipses with two brackets, and my understanding is that the book was written in the first 10 weeks after October 7th, and
That's incredible.
just that sense, the poet Robert Duncan connects response and responsibility, right? And that sense of being able to respond in real time to the war, to the tragedy, and to the loss of life. It's a really extraordinary book. So I would say Fadi Judah.
So one book that I go back to is called Curb by Divya Victor, where she was thinking a lot about anti-Asian violence in the United States, but also the relationship between violence and place, and certain places, actual literal intersections in different city streets. So she maps that out. It's beautiful and devastating and poetic and really, really smart. And I feel like many of us might want a book about joy and beauty right now, and this is actually a fiction book. I love reading fiction. Orbital by Samantha Harvey. Am I making that name up? Anyway, but Orbital I found incredible because it's a book in which nothing happens, but everyone's on this spaceship as they're basically kind of orbiting the Earth, but it's a book about awe. And the sentences not only generate awe, they are, they're just, it is a book that you experience awe and you feel something I've just never felt before, just an incredible, like, protection for the planet. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you both for those. And speaking of awe, I know I speak for everyone here when I say that your books bring a huge amount of awe and gratitude for the stories they illuminate. Thank you for these beautiful readings. Thank you for this beautiful conversation. Thank you all for being here and being with us today. And please go and buy their books and ask questions as they get them as you get them signed in the lobby. Thank you so much.
Thank you.